Hey y'all, hope you're having a great day. Just wanted to cover the lecture for chapter one pretty quick. A lot of this is kind of background information and really not too crazy much as this is going to show up on the test. You should study this information, especially the homeostasis information. But besides that, a lot of this is just kind of basics that you should know, and I covered a lot of it during the review. So let's get moving here with chapter one lecture. First off, don't forget that anatomy and physiology are subdisciplines of biology, right? So anatomy studies the form or the structure, and physiology studies the function, right? And here it mentions that these two are inseparable. So we can try our best to separate these two, but they do tend to be inseparable. So if there's a form, it tends to have a function, and if there's a function, it tends to have a form. Um, so let's don't forget that A and P are both related. When we talk about anatomy, again, this is something I covered in the review, that microscopic needs to use a microscope. So to look at the structures, the smallest structures. So the two main forms of microscopic anatomy are cytology and histology. So you should be familiar with those terms. Cyte is the prefix for cell, and hist is the prefix for tissue. So that tells us that cytology is the study of the cells, and that histology is the study of tissues when we're just simply looking at their forms, right? Not their function. Gross anatomy or macroscopic anatomy. So I introduced it as just macroscopic. It's also referred to as gross anatomy. This is what we can see with just our normal eye, unaided eye. So here it says can be approached in several different ways. So here it lists several different types of anatomies. And again, we can take anything and put anatomy after it, and we're just going to study the structure of that. So systemic anatomy, study the structures of the system. Regional anatomy, just study certain regions of the body. Surface anatomy, just on the surface of the body. Comparative, between humans and other animals, for example. Embryology, looking at the development, not from conception to birth. That's not correct at all. Embryology is simply just the first month of the pregnancy, and so that's not correct. This textbook does have some mistakes from here and there. Um, Here's something that I wanted to mention and I forgot to mention in our review. Pathologic. Just the word pathos. I want you to know that word. Pathos. Hear the word pathologic, anatomy, or pathological physiology. Either way, pathos means disease, and you should be aware of that. So pathos, anytime we see patho or pathos linked to something, it talks about diseased. Now again, I'm here to teach you about the human body and how it functions and the structures. Um, at normal times. But what you're studying to become is a health expert, a healthcare expert. And so you're studying to really understand the pathological side of things. In these 2 semesters, in 210 and 211, you're going to learn the basics of how the human body functions normally. But then you're going to become a very disciplined expert once you hit your field, once you hit your nursing program, for example. You're going to start focusing on the pathological side. How do you help someone who is diseased? So here, pathologic anatomy is how do structures change when they're diseased? Okay. So you're going to start to focus a little bit more on the pathologic anatomy and the pathological physiology, and we'll see that. Okay. So again, it's not that dynamic. Okay. It's not changing very much. We've known the human body for a long, long time. We tend to find one or two things here and there, but it is not dynamic and it is not a changing science. I'm not sure exactly what they're referencing there. The physiology is a little bit more dynamic and a little bit more changing. So physiology, again, is talking about how things function. Physiologists, we tend to focus a little bit more on the molecular or the cellular level because that's where the true function is taking place. But a lot of times we still kind of look at specific systems. So cardiovascular phys looks at the heart and the vessels in the blood. Neurophys looks at the nervous system. Respiratory physiology, looking at how the respiratory system works. Again, if we talked about pathophysiology, right? Pathological physiology. So pathophysiology is what's happening when that system or that organ is diseased, and that's what you're going to become an expert on, is that pathological side of both the anatomy and the physiology, especially once you hit your program. Here in these classes, we're going to learn the basics, and then you're going to use the basics in your program to understand what happens when that patient is diseased. Again, we've talked about this, how these tend to be integrated. So if we have a structure, there tends to be a function. And if we have a function, there tends to be a structure that does it for us. Here they're giving an example of the little air sacs in the lungs called alveoli. So simply just that they're air sacs is more of an anatomical statement, but then they function in gas exchange, right? And so that's kind of telling us a little bit about both of them. Here you can kind of see some differences, and you can look this up in your textbook if you'd like. Talks about, a couple different organs or structures, and then it tells you an anatomy view versus the physiology view, right? And it's hard to separate the two sometimes because they do kind of feed on each other. Here again is another image from the textbook that you can go take a look at. This one's dealing, kind of pointing more anatomical structures out. Here are the parts, right? And then on the next page beside it, we're going to see here's more physiological kind of things. Here is the function, not just the part, but here's what's happening inside that part and how it's doing its job in order to keep the body alive and to keep it going. Now, what we're really here to focus on today is homeostasis. Okay, so we're here to mainly focus on that homeostasis. And homeostasis is really talking about a balanced internal environment. Okay, so that's a good way to think about it. A lot of people break it down to very basic terms. They say internal balance, right? And so homeostasis focuses on the internal balance of the body. How are these things balanced to keep us well? So if we are well, we tend to say that our body is in homeostasis, right? Or it's in a homeostatic, stable condition. But whenever we're sick, we tend to say that our homeostasis is out of whack or something's wrong with our homeostasis. And so we need to bring that homeostasis back into balance in order to create wellness, right? So because all of our body is linked together, all these systems are linked and they're integrated and they're interrelated, then it's not as easy as simply affecting one thing. Sometimes you have to affect more than one to bring our body back into that balance. Now, we're going to look at this on a basic scale, and then we're going to talk about how throughout these 2 semesters, how our body maintains its homeostasis when we hit each of these chapters. So, first off, I want you to understand that the body maintains homeostasis by using homeostatic control systems, okay? Sometimes referred to as regulatory control systems as well. And these control systems are very basic. And this is a very simple concept. This is kind of even how our nervous system works in a nutshell, just kind of basically. So there's 3 components. You need to understand that there's a receptor. The receptor is going to receive information about changes in the environment, changes in a stimulus, whether it's there or not. And then we're going to have the control center. The control center is what really determines the balance and kind of forces something else to change in order to keep the body in that balance. Whatever's doing that change is called the effector. So the effector is what's going to change in order to maintain that balance. So again, 3 components: receptor, control center, and effector. Again, the receptor is just some structure detects changes in the environment, changes in the stimulus in a variable. And so the receptor tells us about what has happened. We are no longer in that same balance. We have gone up or down out of balance. So then it relays that information to the control center, and the control center interprets what the receptor sends it. So the receptor sends it that info. The control center says, hey, well, the temperature, for example, has risen too high. So we need to do something. I need to make a change. Well, I'm going to initiate a change. The control center initiates a change, and it's going to change what's called the effector. And the effector is what brings back the homeostasis. So here, for example, if our receptor detects that it's too hot in our body, and the control center, like our hypothalamus, says that it needs to cool down, then the effectors are probably going to be our sweat glands, right? We're going to start to sweat, and then that's going to start to cool us down. So the control center is usually a component of the nervous system, and that is, or the endocrine system, and that's really what's setting that balance. Now, again, the effector is what's going to do the change, what alters in order to change the situation and bring back homeostasis. Okay, so it's a very simple loop. We have a stimulus, we detect it with the receptor, send the info to the control center kind of integrates the information, and determines the response. So it initiates the change in the effectors, and homeostasis is maintained through changing those effectors. Again, I mentioned temperature. And so here's a good example. If we use this as a temperature gauge, here, this is just kind of any gauge though, right? We want to be within the homeostasis range. If we go too low or we go too high, well, then that stimulus is going to be received by some receptor. For example, our temperature can be detected in our skin. And the control center is really where we set the norm, the homeostatic norm. And so, for example, with temperature, that's going to be our hypothalamus. That's where our thermostat is, 98.6. And so, what it's going to do is it's going to change that. So here we're going to change something. Usually it's a muscle or an organ, and that's going to bring us back into our homeostasis. So here we're going to affect some glands, some sweat glands to start sweating, and that's going to cool us back down, right? Now, what I've just described, this process of homeostasis kind of being maintained around a set point, okay, around a specific range or specific area that we want to keep that in, well, that's referred to as negative feedback. So temperature's a great example of that. 98.6 is our body temp. If we get too hot, we sweat. If we get too cold, we shiver. And so we're trying to keep that 98.6 as our set point. If we get outside of it, then we try to do something, our effectors do something to bring us back to that set point. So this is what most homeostasis tends to be, is just a balancing act. And we call that, again, negative feedback. So this negative feedback, it allows us to keep our temperature. It allows us to keep blood sugar, for example. If you're familiar with diabetics, gases, all these different things that need to be in the proper balance. So most of our homeostasis comes about through the process of negative feedback, or more of the balancing to the set point. Okay. Again, I mentioned that temperature regulation is the best example. So as your body temp drops, we're going to detect it, send that info to the hypothalamus, and then ends up telling blood vessels in the skin that they need to open. And they need to close, and then that's going to constrict the blood, keep less blood flowing to the skin, and then we're also going to start the muscle shivering, right? So here's two different effectors, blood vessels and muscles, and a third one in our skin to create goosebumps, right? And so all three of these are going to bring us back into that homeostatic balance. Here's our buddy fishing, kind of showing us all of this, how he's starting to get cold. So the temperature is detected. Hypothalamus is really our set point area, our control center. Then we're going to change multiple effectors to fix that, to bring his body temp back into the normal range. Now, and that's the rest of that body temp info. Here's if it goes high, it's just kind of doing the opposite, where we start to sweat to bring it down. Here's some other examples of regulation. Anything is an example of regulation dealing with our body, though. Okay, so let's just keep it basic, and let's just connect temperature, body temp with negative feedback for right now. Heart rate, blood pressure, your breathing rate, release of hormones. All of these are good examples of negative feedback controlled loops. Now, the other option for homeostasis, instead of keeping it at a balance, is to take it to one of the extremes. Okay, so instead of maintaining a balance, maybe in a survival situation especially, we're trying to make it more and more exaggerated in order to get to the end of the process. So a good example there that might make more sense is something like blood clotting. Okay, if you're clotting blood, you don't want to bleed out. You don't want to go to the extreme of bleeding out. You want to go to the extreme of not bleeding at all. You don't want to maintain bleeding though, right? You don't want to maintain that bleeding. So the goal here is positive wants to go to no bleeding. So clotting is a good example of a positive feedback loop, how it kind of builds on itself and it gets faster and faster to try to clot that blood as quick as possible. Maybe an even better example, I personally think this is a better example, is labor, delivery. The smooth muscle contractions in the uterus that cause that labor contraction, that the baby to move out of mama, then these contractions get stronger and stronger and stronger. And the goal is not to keep the baby in anymore. That was what that was what the negative feedback did for 9 months. Now we're in this positive feedback moment where it's time to get the baby out. So the contractions are going to get stronger and stronger and stronger. And it's going to that extreme of baby needs to go out instead of baby staying in, right? And so labor contraction and blood clotting, these are two of the best examples where it moves the stimulus in the same direction. We're trying to kind of build on the last one to get to our final end. We're going to an end instead of trying to maintain a balance. That's kind of the way to think about it. Okay. Another thing is a lot of times these, again, tend to be more survival situations. Our everyday kind of things tend to be a negative feedback balancing act. But then in these survival situations, we tend to kick in and we need to go to this positive feedback, to an extreme to make sure that we maintain survival. Another positive feedback loop that they mention is going to be breastfeeding. So they like to use this as the example more. Here, I talked about these other two examples a little bit better. But again, breastfeeding is another example. The baby suckling is going to trigger the sensory receptors. So that message is sent to the hypothalamus. Hypothalamus signals the posterior pituitary to release oxytocin, and oxytocin is also going to be working, I don't see it here, with prolactin. And so these guys, oxytocin is going to stimulate the mammary glands to eject the breast milk. Okay. And so here again, we're not maintaining a balance. We are heading to an end. The end is breastfeeding, ejecting the breast milk. And so this cycle continues to work as long as the baby suckles. But again, we're not maintaining no milk. We're going to the end of keeping the milk flowing as long as the baby is suckling. Okay. Again, I prefer for the test that you focus on clotting and labor as examples of positive, and then temperature as an example of negative feedback. Okay, so here again is that example, kind of showing it to you in a little bit more of that diagram. So we can see the stimulus is the baby suckling, and then the receptors are on the skin, and that's sent to the hypothalamus, and that's going to cause the release of that oxytocin. Oxytocin then flows through the bloodstream, or as it flows through the bloodstream as a hormone and affects the mammary glands to release the milk. Prolactin has already made the milk, so oxytocin is here for the letdown of the milk. So the milk is released in the baby. As long as the baby continues that, then we're going to continue this process of releasing that milk. And again, this is a survival loop. Think about it. The baby needs this to survive. So maintaining homeostasis maintains health. So this is kind of the end of this chapter, really, as far as the lecture. But maintaining homeostasis helps maintain the health of the whole body. We say that if a person is well, then they're in a homeostasis, right? And so, whenever we get outside, when our systems start to fail, when our metabolism starts to fail, that's when we start to see a homeostatic imbalance, and that's when we start to see disease. So, you as a healthcare professional, this stuff may sound basic, or it may sound even, I don't know, could sound advanced to you. I don't know, but it may sound unimportant. But in the long run, this is super important, because when somebody's body can't maintain the balance through negative or positive feedback loops, then that's when you as a nurse, you as whatever your position is going to be, is going to come in and help them to maintain that balance artificially. You're going to help them with medicine or help them with procedures. They're going to try to get their homeostasis back into balance and get rid of their diseased condition, right? So very important for everybody here that's going into a healthcare field. At that point, we have finished the lecture for chapter 1. Again, I want you to focus a little bit more on that homeostasis information than anything else. And I will talk to you guys at the next recording and our next class. Hope you guys have a great day. All right, bye-bye.